Salvete omnes, this is Amelia, also known as TheMartianGeek, and it's time to talk about Crash Bandicoot The Wrath of Cortex, or Crash Bandicoot 4. I don't care what anyone says, this game will always be the real Crash 4 to me. I will say, though, I remembered this game being better. It's not bad by any means, but comparing my thoughts about it now to my experience playing it when I was 13, the picture in my mind was definitely rosier. The main problem with the game, by far, is the over-reliance on vehicle gimmicks. Some will say that the long loading times were the worst part, but I don't think that was as big a deal as the actual gameplay, especially since newer versions of the game fixed that, as did non-PS2 versions. Each of the first 4 Crash games has a higher ratio of vehicle and other gimmick levels to ones that aren't than any of the previous ones. If we consider levels where you're in a vehicle, being chased by something, riding an animal, dealing with the darkness gimmick, underwater, or playing as Coco, Crash 1 still has 20 levels that don't fit any of those. Crash 2, however, only has 14. Crash 3 only has 11, or 9 if we count Baby T in that as well. He's similar enough to normal gameplay that I didn't. Crash 4, though? This game only has 5. Levels 1, 11, 20, 21, and 25 are perfectly normal platforming. Every other level has at least one part that falls into at least one of those categories. Even if you don't count Coco as a gimmick, that still only adds one more level to the count. And even level 20 still had a climbing section. This is also the biggest problem with Crash 3. That game seems to have a much better reputation than this one does, but I really don't understand how someone could love Crash 3 and hate Crash 4, since aside from the loading time issue, the two games literally have the exact same freaking problems. Also, I feel like even though Crash 3 had more good levels, its bad levels were at least as bad as Crash 4's, if not worse. Like, at least Crash 4 doesn't have Area 51 or Mad Bombers. Now, gameplay changes and even out-of-genre experiences are not necessarily a bad thing, but they're another one of those things, like water levels, that really have to be handled cautiously because they're very easy to do poorly. I generally didn't mind the animal riding levels, though those are noticeably absent from Crash 4 for some reason, but most of the rest were just not fun. With few exceptions, the vehicles were harder to control, harder to attack with, and harder to avoid enemies in than regular Crash was, and I would have rather just had regular Crash. Or even Coco. Her levels were probably the least egregious of the gimmicks in Crash 4, at least she could still jump and spin and stuff. And even if the gimmick levels were good, you still shouldn't make them be over half the game, especially since there aren't that many levels to begin with, and especially in a genre as sparsely populated as 3D platformers. Like I said, Crash 3 definitely started this annoying trend. Naughty Dog made a level where you're in a motorcycle race, and for some questionable reason decided that they needed 4 of them. And then 4 jet ski levels, 2 levels plus a boss in a plane, and then the new developers did the same dang thing with Crash 4. The main new vehicle gimmick for this game seems to be the Atmosphere, which I'll admit isn't the least fun vehicle they've come up with, unless of course you're doing them in time trial, but we still didn't need 4 of the things, or even 5 if you count the first boss. I mean, come on, people. If the designers of these games had made Yoshi's Island, there'd be 4 entire levels consisting of nothing but skiing, and 3 played entirely as the mole tank, and maybe 2 where you spend the entire thing as a train. You get the point. I think replaying this game and Crash 3 again has made me appreciate the original Crash Bandicoot more, honestly. Say what you want about the bridge levels in Crash 1, but at least that game knew what genre it was and stuck to it instead of trying to cram 2 or 3 others in there. That's also one of the few things that new Crash 4 does right. It's a miserable play experience, especially if you're going for completion, but at the very least it is a 3D platformer that does not try to be anything other than a 3D platformer. Wrath of Cortex, though, this doesn't have unexpected gameplay changes, it has unexpected gameplay staying the same. Then there are other things that get in the way of having a good time with this game, just not as much. For one, seriously, what is with the horrendously slow climbing speed? This wasn't a problem for the climbing sections in Crash 2 or 3. Why did they change it? I vaguely recall reading some flimsy excuse that they had for making it this way, something about it either being too fast or being unrealistic. Well, we certainly have to maintain realism in our video game about a mutant orange cartoon bandicoot fighting a mad scientist, don't we? And making it this slow just makes significant parts of levels 17, 20, 22, and 24 incredibly boring for no reason. Then there are the secret paths. Most of them in this game are fine, but there are a couple that stand out, especially among the gem routes. The green gem path is the only one that I would consider good. The yellow one is okay, but it is more minecart shenanigans. The purple gem one is inoffensive, but also not very creative. The red gem path is kind of frustrating because of some of the camera angles and obstacle arrangement, and I still don't know what they were thinking with that nitro placement at the beginning. The blue gem route, that one is just awful. It's not interesting, fun, or a well-crafted challenge. It's just one awkward jump onto a single block-wide platform after another. The fact that I couldn't remember most of the other secret pathways, but could remember this one vividly because of the sheer trauma it induced says something. The secret warp room levels are also terrible. Crash Bandicoot games have never had a great record with secret levels. It certainly doesn't help that none of them are standard platforming, unless you count Agapus Rex or Fumbling in the Dark. Between all 14 to 16 secret levels in all 4 games, there are only 2 that I thought were so much as decent, the animal riding ones from the first 2 games. But Crash 4s are phoned in even compared to the other games. It really says something when nighttime is probably the best level in the warp room and it's almost completely recycled from an earlier level. Why do game developers have so much trouble making decent secret levels? Seriously. Also, I don't think the time trials should have been mandatory. I mean, they're not required to beat the game, but they are for getting the true ending, so it counts. At least you technically only have to do 25 of them, though, so you can skip the 4 worst levels if you want. The 5th one would be level 30, since you need to get 25 relics before then to unlock it anyway. Still, not everyone enjoys that style of gameplay, including me, so having them there just for bragging rights really would have been a better idea. Now, is there anything good that I could say about this game? Of course. If it didn't have any good points, I wouldn't have played it. The soundtrack is certainly good, probably the most well-made part of this entire game, in fact. Each level has its own music, at least in the PS2 version, and while that does mean there's less to tie levels of the same theme together, it also means that you get more cool songs to listen to. And really, few if any of the tracks are bad. At worst, a few of them are just too quiet and ambient to notice, and at best, well, this game probably has some of my favorite tracks in the series. In fact, I think out of all the games in the series, Crash 4 has the best soundtrack overall. Crash 1's soundtrack was okay, Crash 2's was good, Crash 3's was decent, Crash 5's was a bunch of weird a cappella stuff that mostly sounded horrid. The first Game Boy Advance game mostly just used remixes from Crash 2 and 3, the second Game Boy Advance game had a few good tunes, and I didn't pay enough attention to any of the music in any of the other games to have a meaningful opinion on it. So congratulations, Wrath of Cortex, you're the best at least one thing. Also, they completely eliminated backtracking in this game. Heck yes! If you played some of the earlier games and remember having to backtrack through parts of levels to get gems, you know why that's such a big deal. Say, if you're trying to get the box gem for level 17 or 18 in Crash 2. Honestly, Crash 2 was horrible about that. It's still my favorite game in the series, but some of the gems were a complete pain in the butt to get because of that. As much as I complain about the vehicle levels, are any of them really worse than having to do Cold Hard Crash's death route twice? And though the standard platforming sections are few in number, they're still just as good as they were in any other game when they do show up. The bosses are also okay, or at least the middle 3 are. Crash games probably hit a bit below average on the quality of bosses in general, but I'd say most of the bosses in this game are about expected for the series, and the elemental mask theme was kind of a neat idea. So overall, I enjoy Crash Bandicoot The Wrath of Cortex. I enjoyed it as a kid, and playing it again now, the cracks definitely show, but I'd say it holds up about as well as Crash 3. As I said, I'd still rather play it than the new Crash 4. Both games could have been much better than they ended up being, but for different reasons. This game had quite a few bad ideas, most of them related to the vehicle levels and their overuse, but I'd say that the majority of them were more lame and pointless than they were obnoxious and frustrating. It becomes worse when you're going for completion, which is where you get nuisances like Coral Canyon's time trial and pretty much everything about Eskimo Roll. When just playing through them, you get levels like 13 and 28 that have little reason to exist, and level 27, which you can win by doing absolutely nothing, as well as levels like 2, 3, and 9 that aren't really frustrating but also offer pretty much no challenge, but most of the actual difficulty, such as that displayed in level 25, is legit and doesn't depend on cheap gimmicks. Compare that to the new Crash 4, which has some actually pretty good ideas. The new mask powers were pretty cool, and it was interesting getting to play as additional characters with different abilities. Certainly it did a better job with that than this game did. With Coco, I mean. But it took those good ideas and then it wasted them by cranking up the difficulty so far the knob broke off. Seriously, Mega Man and Bass was easier than that game. I don't know what they were thinking. And as frustrating as it is to get completion in this game, given that levels like Eskimo Roll and Coral Canyon exist, I'd play them 100 times before I'd go for 100% and it's about time. And the sad thing is, Toys for Bob had about 20 years more games to compare to than Vicarious Visions did around the turn of the millennium, so which game really deserves the L more? It is kind of sad how many games I've seen that could have been great but dropped the ball, but in the grand scheme of things, Wrath of Cortex is really not that bad at all. With that in mind, let's discuss some of my favorite and least favorite things in the game, shall we? I have lists for my top 7 least favorite levels, my top 7 favorite levels, and my favorite music tracks. Why top 7, you may be wondering? Well, it's because with only 30 levels, top 10 seemed like too many, but top 5 didn't seem like enough. So, without further ado, my least favorite levels. Number 7, Droid Void, level 17. This one isn't really that bad, just kind of boring. It seems very empty for such a long level. There's just not that much going on, including in the gem area. In addition, it has a climbing section, which of course is as slow as ever. It has the mech, which is one of the better vehicles but still clunky. And the time trial not only brings out the worst parts of said mech, but takes forever in general and has some of the strictest times in the game. The theme and atmosphere of this one are pretty cool, and the music doesn't suck, but the gameplay doesn't hold up very well, especially compared to the other on-foot levels. Number 6, Seashell Shenanigans, level 7. Water levels in Crash games rarely, if ever, get praise from me, and this one is certainly no exception. It may be the easiest of the 2 1/3 water levels in the game, but that doesn't mean it's any more fun. Crash's controls in water have never been good, in or out of a vehicle, and Crash 4's water levels in particular are just too darn long for how slow they are and how hard it is to see everything, which naturally gets especially bad when you're going for the gem or relic. Number 5, Solar Bowler, level 29. Objectively speaking, it's one of the better levels in the secret warp room, and I suspect that it looks more difficult than it actually is, given that I didn't struggle much with the time trial and almost never actually fell off the tilting platforms. Still though, this one is very anxiety-inducing. In addition to having kind of a confusing layout, it has a lot of fairly narrow paths, some of which have nitros on them, and others of which don't stay put, and even if you don't fall off, which you probably will at least once, the threat is constantly there, which isn't true for even the worst of the other Atmosphere levels. Number 4, Smokey and the Bandicoot, level 13. This is a bit of an odd one out. I will admit that it is not that hard. It's not as much of a pushover as Ghost Town or Ice Station Bandicoot, but it still feels like a pointless level that had no reason to exist. Also, unlike levels 27 and 28, or even Crash 3's motorcycle levels, this one has horrendous controls for the vehicle of the occasion. The handling has been compared to a shopping cart full of rocks, which is an apt description. The Jeep in level 6 didn't seem to be that bad, so what gives? Are the two actually coded differently, or is it just less noticeable in level 6 because you don't have to turn and go around pits and stuff? Number 3, Force of Nature, level 30. This is basically this game's obligatory testament to the fact that checkpoint starvation ruins everything. If it had checkpoints, it would definitely be less bad, almost like a variant of the animal riding levels. It still wouldn't be great, though. The angle of the camera and Coco's movement makes it really awkward to get boxes if you don't have the level memorized, and it's another level that just doesn't have much going on in it. The only obstacles are the skiers and nitros, and it's the final unlockable secret level to add insult to injury. Number 2, Coral Canyon, level 19. It's everything I said about Seashell Shenanigans, but even more so. It's even longer, significantly harder, and not friendly to anyone going for collectibles. The time trial in particular is a headache and a half, and an excellent reason to point to for why they should have been optional. It literally took me 10 times the attempts that level 7s did to get a relic. There's a time trial guide online where the writer has their own times posted for each level, and almost all of them are platinum, but this is one of the few levels that isn't, which makes it all the more impressive that I actually managed to pull it off. I think it might have been a fluke, or equally likely a result of having the wretched thing burned into my mind because I just kept having to do it over and over. Bleh. Number 1, Eskimo Roll, level 14. Yeah, this shouldn't be that much of a surprise. It's weird that out of the 4 Atmosphere levels, it's the second one that's the worst, or the third out of 5 if you count Rumble in the Rocks. The level isn't terrible if you're only going for the crystal, but getting either of the collectibles is frustrating as heck. The terrain is uneven and there are some very awkward platforms to have to deal with, some with boxes on them. That one box especially. The one above that tiny platform that's not even as wide as the Atmosphere itself and that moves. It is a freaking miracle that I didn't die more times getting that. Easily the hardest box in the game to get. And as for the time trial, well, there's a Mexican saying that basically translates to God didn't give scorpions wings, meaning that at least something bad isn't even worse. Most levels in the game, even the annoying ones, at least do not have both an annoying gem and an annoying relic. This, however, is one of the rare exceptions. You don't have to get that one box, but you do have to try to navigate the entire level in one go, with all of its hazards and awkward terrain, and it's not exactly short either. This scorpion absolutely has wings, and possibly some bombardier beetle glands as well. Truly, this is the worst level in the game. It's not the most pathetic, that would be level 27. It's not the most lacking in design, that's probably level 28. It's not the most boring or tedious either, that's most likely level 19. It's not even the most objectively difficult, that would probably be the blue gem pathway. But it combines several annoying things to create an annoyance that is greater than the sum of its parts and makes the players suffer for it. Now let's talk about my favorite levels. Number 7, Wizards and Lizards, level 4. It's just your typical Crash platforming and attacking enemies with the obligatory 4th level chase sequence, and the dragon chase isn't even that bad. The end of it can get kinda tricky, but it doesn't seem like it's terribly strict, and it might even be kinda fun. Good music, too. While it is outdone by other levels, this is a fine level in its own right. Number 6, Compactor Reactor, level 5. All of the End of Warp Room Factory levels are at least decent, and this is probably the best of them. At least it has the best vehicle section out of levels 5, 10, and 15, along with another good music track and various enemies and obstacles. Number 5, Arctic Antics, level 1. This isn't really a typical first level for Crash Bandicoot, or any game really. How many games do you know of where level 1 is an ice level? Rabbit Rampage qualifies, but it only had snow with no actual ice physics. Unusual as it may be, I think it's a fine introduction to the game. It has some decent length to it, it's by far longer than any previous Crash first level, and it has some variety in scenery and layout, what with the tunnel, the islands, and the lake, and whatnot. I wish the levels in this game had stayed this good. If they'd kept meeting the threshold that they started with, maybe the game would have done better. Ah well. Number 4, Banzai Bonsai, level 8. Coco's first level and by far her best. This one has quite a nice variety in its layout and hazards. It's fairly long, but never starts to feel stale like, say, level 17 does. It goes different directions, over different terrain, and even switches to an overhead view at one point. And the scenery is honestly quite pretty, too. Yeah, Coco doesn't have all the same moves that Crash does, but this one comes early enough in the game that it doesn't really matter, and there's a lot to like here regardless. Number 3, the Gauntlet, level 11. If I remember correctly, this is the first level during the LP where I actually commented on how good it was. It's quite platform-centric, with much more of a focus on traps and moving objects than many levels in the game. It's kind of like if you took the Lost City from Crash 1, made it easier, and switched the theme to medieval. Compared to similar levels in other games, this one isn't terribly hard, but it is fun. Number 2, Cortex Vortex, level 25. This is one of the very rare instances in this game where a level feels challenging, but in a fun way. A lot of the difficult parts of the game are mostly just annoying for one reason or another, be it the awkward platforming kind of annoyance like the blue gem pathway or the awkward gimmick kind of annoyance like the Atmosphere levels. But Cortex Vortex doesn't really feel like that. It feels like a good challenge, one where you don't have to get used to different physics or controls or the camera making depth perception hard. You just have to observe obstacles and figure out how to avoid them, where to jump, and when to attack. And isn't that what platformers are all about? It should be, at least. I will say that this level could have used one more checkpoint, probably either at the end of the beginning section once you stop going toward the camera, or slightly earlier in that same section, and the moving red platforms didn't need to be as slow as they were. Still though, this is a very good level, with very good music, and I'm glad that they finished strong. Number 1, Crash and Burn, level 21. Here it is, the best level in the game. How can we count the ways? To start off, the theme is pretty neat. Volcanic or otherwise fiery tropical levels really should show up more often in video games than they do, considering their association. Surprisingly, the only other ones I can think of are from another Crash game, Entranced. The music isn't as good as the last one, but it's still decent enough. The level is fairly dynamic, being another one that's quite long but manages to avoid wearing out its welcome by mixing up and alternating the obstacles and enemies. One moment you're dodging nitros and parrots, the next you're jumping on platforms over lava, and then you go into the cave and come back out. The collectibles are fairly tricky, but only because the level is so long, and honestly the death route isn't bad either as far as level of fun and interest goes. This level kind of has a bit of everything. It does several things well and doesn't really do anything poorly. If all the levels in the game were of this quality, this would probably be my favorite Crash Bandicoot game. Sadly, we have to deal with what we have, but enjoy it while it's there. I also have a few honorable mentions of the sort that I'd like to discuss. These levels didn't make it onto either list, but I have things to say about them anyway. First of all, levels 2 and 9, as well as 27 and 28. That's Tornado Alley, That Sinking Feeling, Ghost Town, and Ice Station Bandicoot. These all fall into the category of not very good, but at least they're easy. 27 and 28 are among the weakest, most nothing levels in the game, and 2 and 9 are flying, which is not a style of gameplay that I've ever liked since they introduced it in Crash 3, but none of these are frustrating or tedious enough for me to really dislike them, including when going for the gem Relic. I considered putting level 13 in here as well, but I decided that its crappy controls give it just enough edge to push it into being actually kind of annoying. Then there are levels 3 and 23, Bamboozled and Medieval Madness, the Atmosphere levels that I tolerated at least well enough not to put them among my least favorites. They're still a lot closer to the bottom of the ranking than they are to the top, but level 3 is fairly easy, and 23 really isn't that bad. It is annoying to do on time trial, but only on time trial. The Crystal and Gem are just fine, maybe even kind of fun for an Atmosphere level. In fact, if I'd made the lists a little bit longer, 23 could very well have been on both of them, sense be darned. It probably has the biggest discrepancy between the amount of fun I had with the normal run and with the time trial of any level in the game, except maybe the one I'm about to talk about, level 22, Gold Rush. This is actually a perfectly fine level to just play through. I could have done without the pointless minecart section and boring climbing section, but they weren't that bad. I almost had it on my favorites list at one point, but then we get to the time trial, and for being mostly standard platforming, this one is a pain. The enemies with unclear hitboxes, depth perception issues, the RNG of the dynamite and such, all that isn't a big deal when you only have to do a fifth of the level at once, but playing the entire thing in one go greatly increases the odds that you'll slip up and have to start all over, and it means there's a lot of ground to retread when you do try again. And consider that this level would actually be short by new Crash 4 standards, not to mention easy, and that game still has time trials. Fear. Finally, levels 6 and 20, Jungle Rumble and Wuthering Heights. When I was ranking my favorites, it was actually a pretty close contest between both of these and levels 4 and 5. I had a fairly easy time coming up with the top 5, and then there was pretty much a 4-way tie for 6th and 7th place, so I guess you know what 8th and 9th would have been. While the first half of level 6 was better than level 4, I think 4's chase sequence was better than 6's, while 20 had a climbing section and comparatively wasn't actually that interesting. So yeah, notice how almost all of my least favorites were vehicle levels, while almost all of my favorites were standard platforming levels? Yeah, that's not a coincidence. The quality also doesn't really have a consistent average throughout. It starts generally strong, hits a slump in the middle, and then picks back up at the end. Poor Warp Room 4, it had 2 least favorites and no favorites. The only decent level there was 20, which still didn't make it into the top 7. Anyway, moving on to the bosses. I don't have lists for these since there are only 5 of them, so I'll just discuss my single favorite and least favorite of them. My least favorite boss is the first one, Rumble in the Rocks. In addition to being misspelled, it uses the Atmosphere after you've only had one level to practice it, and in an awkwardly shaped arena to boot. It's also the only boss where you can have part of your progress undone. Crunch's Earthball might not be his strongest elemental form, but it's certainly his most annoying. It's tedious, drawn out, and not really all that fun, especially for only being the first boss. Not really the best initial impression of Crunch, to be honest. I can't quite say that he's the most annoying first boss I've ever faced in a video game because Vigolian from Ys Origin exists, but he's definitely up there. Meanwhile, my favorite boss is the fourth one, Atmospheric Pressure. Pressure like a giant ball of electricity and it just won't stop? While I will admit that none of the bosses in this game are particularly great, this one is at least somewhat interesting. It has decent music and some actual variety in Crunch's attacks and how you react to them. Sure, he always repeats the same pattern until he dies, but it's fine. Funny enough, the first boss is really the only one that actually has any sort of AI beyond do attack, do different attack, do other different attack, go to 10, but it didn't save that one from being annoying. Crunch being so pattern-based doesn't really hurt him here. And hey, I guess the plane really isn't so bad when it only needs to face one direction. I wish that it had an option for whether or not to invert the y-axis, but that only caused me to die twice during the LP. It's fine, right? Finally, my top 10 favorite music tracks, or favorite level music tracks anyway. I will say that my favorite boss theme is definitely the third one, but all of these are out of the 30 main level music tracks. I'll also be using text commentary for those so that you can listen to them more clearly, though in the interest of time I won't play the full tracks. I'd like you all to hear the full version, but the tracks in this game are fairly long, and I'd rather not add 20 minutes to the video if I don't have to, so I'll just select some choice parts. So I guess the only levels in this game that I didn't have anything to say about in these lists, at least not explicitly calling them out by name, were 12, 15, 16, 18, and 26. Of course, now that I've said that, I have mentioned them, so that no longer applies, and it's a paradox or something. Anyway, that's about all I have to say about Crash Bandicoot The Wrath of Cortex, the original Crash Bandicoot 4. There's nothing else worthwhile that I can think of to do with this game. I could potentially redo some of the time trials and get better relics. There are a few levels that I definitely feel like I could get better times on, such as 5 and 8, but why would I do that? Though this game has its flaws, I still think it's underrated, about as good as Crash 3 and better than the new Crash 4. Maybe it deserves a remake like the first 3 games got, but I'm not actually sure what all they do with it. Most of the worst problems with the PS1 Crash games were related to Crash 1, and the remake entirely fixed one of the 2 biggest problems with it and mostly fixed the second. For Crash 1, all they had to do was give it a sensible save system, make the gems less strict to get, and maybe change how the bonus rooms worked, and it instantly became a much better game. This game wouldn't be that easy. They could fix the loading times and maybe make a couple of the gem paths easier, but to fix anything else about Crash 4, they'd pretty much have to reimagine half the game. Someday, maybe we'll get a second Insane collection that gives this game and Twinsanity the love they would have gotten had they actually had a proper development cycle, but I'm certainly not holding my breath. To summarize this game, the vehicle levels suck and there are too many of them, the regular platforming levels are mostly fine, climbing sucks because it's too slow, the soundtrack is great, I didn't like most of the time trials and feel that they should have been optional, especially since they made several levels way more annoying than they were otherwise, 22 and 23 come to mind. The secret levels were an underwhelming mess, the bosses in Coco's moveset could have used some improvement but were passable, and this game is still better than anything in the series that came after it. With that, we are done here, so I'll see you next project.